we walk into bookstores, the few that still exist, and we tend to see novels categorized as fiction, historical fiction, romance, science fiction, horror, fantasy. Now you can go on Amazon and you could search for novels set in 19th century France with zombies and find those. All three of your novels to this point are set in Jamaica and set at a moment that is not the present. They're historical novels. Do you think of yourself as a historical novelist?
No. And yes. I'm obsessed with the past, but when I wrote Brief History, I had no idea I was writing a historical novel. Turns out the 70s is history now.
That's right.
I thought I was writing a contemporary novel. I was like, I'm talking about Disco Duck. It's set in it moves all the way to the 90s. I thought I was writing something pretty contemporary. But that said, I am obsessed with the past. I don't know if I can't remember. Well, this is Brief History is a novel. I always said I could never write a novel with a car in it. When I wrote one, no, but it's. I don't know if I guess I'm a historical novelist in the sense that I am obsessed with history. And I'm obsessed with how big events the ripple effect on people who aren't necessarily big. It's funny, up to this date, I still get more invitations from history departments than English departments.
That's interesting.
It is interesting. But I think, because it's not like I'm necessarily writing history books, but again, the characters in all my books are usually real from the impact of real events, and it's characters who wouldn't make history books, but may have made history or caused history. So I think in that sense, yes. But I do think there's some conventions to the historical novel that I don't believe in.
Such as?
Such as, I think that sometimes history novels tend to revise history. Like if your character, chances are if your character is from 1800, he or she was probably racist. But she's such a plucky heroine. And I think there is a kind of revisionism that happens sometimes. I also think if somebody is looking for a straight up history, there's commercial fiction, there's quote unquote literary fiction. We're going to talk about categories. I'm a big disbeliever in categories. So you can imagine how I get furious sometimes when I go into a bookstore.
Right.
It's not a designation I run away from. But I do think there is a little bit more going on.
So you have now written enough so that there is a body of Marlon James work. 3 novels, you have a new novel, a 4th novel coming out in February that we'll talk about. As you now look at your own work, in some ways from a distance, pulling back from the act of creating it and now looking at it as a reader, maybe as a critic of your own work, what are the strands that run through the body of work of Marlon James?
Oh my God, I don't know. Repressed homosexuality? I don't know. I think, certainly reckoning with the history we've been left with, all 3 of them. In the first novel, it was about religious mania and a kind of blank slate, a sort of unquestioned power that we give and still give religion in Jamaica. People ask me why I think homophobia endures in Jamaica. I go, the church. We'd have to mince words here. It's a church. And I think they also, all 3 of them in a way, show what happens when institutions of power become corrupt. Or if they were to begin with, and how people how people reel from that. One thing I think I'm still interested in, I'm certainly interested in with the new book, which is set in a mythical Africa, but I'm interested in language. I'm interested in language as communication. I'm interested in language as resistance. language as celebration and triumph, and language as shaping identity. Because that's my story as well. It took me a while to really embrace Jamaican patois in a novel, because I bought into the story I was fed that patois is broken English, meaning it needs to be fixed. We're joking backstage that even British English is pretty bad. I was telling them it's a car. It's not a car. I'm going to the car. It's not a car. It's a car. So, and I think in a very selfish way, and it's something I would never have thought of 10 years ago, and I would totally deny it 10 years ago. There is a kind of self-affirmation for me in writing these books. Because I think there are so many things that can interfere in the process of getting something from your head down to the page, including you wondering what kind of book you should write and who will read it. And I think all those things can really mess with that process in between the space here and there. And I think certainly with the last two books, there's been more of what's on the page is what's in my head.
Right. You mentioned self-affirmation. So remind me how many times the manuscript for the first novel was rejected.
Oh God, less than 80.
More than 70.
More than 70. More than 77.
So
but less than 80. But less than 80.
Not that you remember.
Not that I remember.
So does that still play in your head every time you sit down and write, or every time you win an award or get a good review?
My second novel, I think a lot of people have this story that my first novel was rejected. How many times I was rejected, it was smooth sailing after that. But my second novel was rejected 18 times. Nobody in publishing wanted it. And the one thing I noticed from first novel to second novel is that the quality of my rejection letters got so much better. It's some of them were actually quite beautiful, even though they were saying no. So it's not like it has been. It's the new novel, which you think everybody would be jumping for. In the UK, are still running into rejections. It ran into, to come back to the whole thing about categorization, it ran into problems of genre.
Right.
Where some of the response to quite a few of the publishers there was that it's too fantasy for literary readers and too literary for fantasy readers, so neither will read it. And I think in the UK, funny enough, genres are even more regimented. Than here. It's part of the process, and part of being a writer is you do have to kind of believe that yes, 100 people can be wrong about a book they reject. They certainly can be wrong about a book they accept.
Right.
I read How to Make Love Like a Porn Star so that you won't have to. I'm not in the process of trashing really terrible books other than 50 Shades of Grey, but bad decisions are made all the time, and publishers are human, but I also think publishers can be really guilty of very short-sighted, of quite a bit of short-sightedness. Even with sales and with whatever, sometimes it's still a struggle to get people to believe that people want to read what you want to say.
Now, you mentioned in talking about the threads that run through your work, the question of power. And that does lead me into this issue of politics and how you see your role as a writer in relation to politics broadly or narrowly defined. So one of the things that we talked about, as Edward mentioned in an earlier conversation, was your belief that all writing, in one way or another, is a political act. Unpack that a little bit. How do you think about writing as a political act?
In a few ways. One wasn't my idea, but Jeanette Winterson, when she said reading is an act of free will and it's a private act, which in itself. So before we even get to writing, reading. it's easy to forget here, where we take a lot of freedoms for granted, just, how dangerous just reading is. And I'm not sure it's not dangerous here. Clemson University, gives their students an opt-out clause thing. So there are people who opt out of reading my books there. And so on. So it's still, just the idea that Jeanette was talking about is the fact that you can get liberated without somebody's permission, or you can be liberated without people knowing, that you can be in the middle of the most homophobic place in the world, but under your bed is, a boy's own story. And that one book will save your life because everything else is conspiring to destroy it. That in itself, so that to me is the real identity politics. That to me is something that, thank God, sometimes you're glad people underestimate them. Because if nobody's looking for a book as a weapon, nobody's going to know that you're arming yourself with one. And I think that in itself is without seeking to be political. But I also think that even, not political, quote unquote, it's a political statement. And it's a statement that is steeped in a lot of privilege. And I think there are people who can afford that. But I think even a sort of absence of the political from your work is political. I'm not saying everybody needs to be some firebrand radical. And I'm not saying they have to be on a mission, because I'm not. But I think if you are an artist in the world, you're in some ways reflecting the world. And I think it comes through. I remember Ben Okri is a really, really good friend of mine, but we disagree on a lot. And he was arguing once that when you read something like the Decameron, you can't see the politics in it. And I'm like, you're not reading hard enough. You read the Decameron, you can totally tell what they're trying to escape, and what this book is trying so hard to be hedonistic for a reason. And that you can. It's not that a book doesn't have to scream politics. But I think that certainly quite a few of the really, really great ones, you can, if nothing else, find the context in which they were written.
Right. Are there certain subjects that novelists writing today in some ways cannot escape, either by including or not including them in their books? So issues like race, issues like gender. I mean, in one way or another, either by their presence or their absence, it seems like they're always there.
Yeah, let's look at, for example, the so-called social realist novel, which to me is one of the most preposterous things I've ever heard. Social realism is not realistic. You pick a lot of these social realist novels, there's no person of color in them. And fine, not everywhere in America is super diverse, but chances are not every single person involved in your life is white or of a certain background or so on. And the social realist novel makes a statement with that, in that I'm going to claim reality even though I'm not real. I'm going to claim a sort of, I'm doing a representation of the minutiae of American life, but I'm really not. And I think that that kind of willful ignorance of something is political. When Jonathan Franzen says he doesn't write black people because he doesn't know any, well, that is a statement. Right. That I could never write a black woman as a girlfriend because I've never had a black girlfriend. I was like, I wasn't in the French Revolution, but I write about it. It's like, you are still making choices. And I think that, in a way, and I think even that kind of sort of artistic cowardice is also a kind of political statement. I mean, I'm not trying to sort of hammer it over people's heads. Yes, everything is political, but maybe we should have a broader view of what that means. And I think even the attempt to sort of create this sort of so-called social realism is you're still saying something. Saying that I try not to confront race in my stories is a statement about race. Right. It's like, I don't really deal with gender. That's a statement on gender. It's But it's not something people should. I don't know if it's something that you should run away from either. Nobody's saying you should become an expert on politics. You're just writing about what you see, I think.
Is the act of either writing or even more broadly creating art, is that a particular kind of political act? I mean, in some ways, some people would argue that everything we do is political in the sense that it's about how we relate to each other and power dynamics. But it seems to me that the act of creating art has as a particular and powerful meaning. And I'm wondering if you think about that.
Yeah, but I think, though, a lot of that meaning is may slightly contradict what I was saying about being deliberate, about being political. But because sometimes that politics is a subtext the viewer puts on it. I don't think Bruce Springsteen set out to be a political songwriter, but then it happens, and sometimes it's the viewer that puts that, subtext on it. A lot of the songs we accept as anthems didn't start out that way. I didn't think. I mean, maybe she was, but I think that all the subtext we put on Aretha Franklin's respect, we put it there. But why not? So there's that. There is ways in which we choose to interpret or embrace, certain kinds of art. And I think it's the word itself, political. I think people may be sort of scared of or run away from. But I mean, I don't know. I can't think of any great art that doesn't, in some way, speak to the world we're in. I know there are people who keep trying to make that kind of sort of insular thing, but then it's not particularly good.
You are now not only a writer, but a public figure. In addition to writing novels, you have a social media presence. How do you think about your role as a public figure, apart from just being a novelist, in relation to some of these issues? The things that are important to you, the particular political moment we're living in, do you feel some sense of responsibility as someone to whom other people listen?
Yes and no. No, in the sense that I think if I start thinking in terms of it being a kind of burden and responsibility, I might not be as free with what I say as I usually am. To me, I don't necessarily think I'm outspoken so much as just, these are things that should be said, so I'm going to say them. I realized a long time ago that my absolute worst case scenario is that I end up back at my mother's house. And I realized that's the worst case scenario. Like, yeah, I can do whatever the hell I want. I have, despite the fact that sometimes I post on Facebook four times a day, I still have a conflicted relationship with social media. Because I've seen it embrace what I've said, and I've seen it tear me down as well.
Many people might not know the story of your visit to India. And what happened.
Really? We're going to go there?
Yeah, we're going to go right there.
So India has a local airport in Delhi and an international airport. And to get to the rest of India, you have to go through Delhi, the Delhi local airport. I didn't know they had a different weight restriction for local, and it was just going through a whole bunch of bureaucracy. Like, when they weighed it first, it was 8 pounds. Then the security at the front didn't tell me I had to go through security, so I had to go back outside and come through security. And when I went back, it was now 12 pounds. X-rays will do that to you. It will add 2 pounds. Not surprising for me, I'm of course live Facebooking all this. And I was like, nice welcome, India.
And what happened?
And by the next morning, it was a headline: Booker Prize winner insults India. It was hilarious. The funniest part is that the thing I loved about it, though, that it was in the gossip section. So, like, right below me would be Arjun and Deepak. Will they get back together? And by day 5, somebody asked me what I think about India. And I'm like, man, I'm just so overwhelmed by everything. Headline: Booker winner overwhelmed by India. And then the first line: it seems Marlon James has changed his opinion of India and the Indians. It's like, I just hate your stupid airport. It's like...
Before we leave social media, have you ever thought that it's just not worth it?
I remember I called it my infamous "Be Nice to White People" post. I wrote this. I was talking about a fight these two activists got into over a really insensitive and quite frankly stupid piece of art that was in Minnesota at the time. And I was just talking about, despite the fact they both got on badly, I mean, everybody gunned for the white guy. And then you have this sort of what I call the kind of careful liberal pileup, where everybody just started nailing in and in and in because they were all scoring righteousness points. It was interesting how people who only a week before would be asking me to come speak at their thing was like, you know, Martin James needs to shut the hell up. Or if he wants to be at the back of the bus, then stay there. And all these things. And I'm like, just in everything, the thing about Facebook, the thing about social media is everything escalates so quickly. That really staggered me for a while. And to the point where I don't think I'm as involved in local issues as I used to be. Because I didn't expect that something like that, sentiment could change so quickly on a dime. And I also thought that my previous record should have carried some currency. And none of that mattered because and that's one of the things about social media, I think. You know, the funniest thing, funny strange, not funny haha, is that I was in an actual face-to-face argument that exploded. And at one point I'm like, you know, it's social media that did this. So even real-life arguments now escalate super quickly. And I think part of it is because I think part of it is something that social media did. I say that even though I'm probably going to go home and do a Facebook post.
Right.
It's like,
right.
I'm trying to wean myself off it.
And we're probably tweeting something about this event even as we sit here.
When I went to Nigeria, I saw the best of social media. Everybody was live tweeting. You know, Chimamanda Adichie may have heard of Bingavana Wainana, but it's really Twitter and Facebook and so on. Social media did such huge work in connecting writers in the diaspora and artists in the diaspora and so on. Type of discussions we never had before. So I can't knock, you know, the good that it has done and is doing.
Probably the most controversial aspect of your work has been your depiction of violence. Anyone who's read your novels knows that they're not easy on a number of different levels. You ask a lot of your readers, which, as a former English professor, I think is totally appropriate. But one of the ways in which you ask a lot of your readers is by asking them really to confront in very graphic ways the worst kinds of violence. And while in general the critical response has been overwhelmingly positive, there are some people who are put off by that the way they'd be put off by that in a film or in other forms of art. Talk us through how you think about that. I mean, that must be something that you are very conscious about as you write these books.
I always say violence should be violent. I always give this totally out-of-the-way example of Led Zeppelin. Say Led Zeppelin has this reputation of being, you know, the masters of heavy metal. That's what we think of. The heaviest music has ever gotten, the kings of hard rock. But almost every Led Zeppelin album is 60% acoustic. You know, any other artist, that's just a folk album with some rowdy moments. But the loud tracks on a Led Zeppelin album reverberate for so long. You know, they echo for so long. There's so much resonance to them that you still think this is some heavy, hard rocking stuff. And I use that to talk about violence. That there's a difference between, there's a difference between preponderance and resonance. You know, there's a difference between when there's a glut of something and when something reverberates. And I think the reason why my novels get listed as super violent is that the violence reverberates, as it should. In Hollywood, in a Hollywood film, one man can kill 60 people, kiss the damsel formerly in distress, and then we move off into the sunset, and nobody thinks that, those 50 men and women may have been fathers and mothers and sisters. Some of them may have been forced to do this. Some of them had no choice. That these acts have consequences and they have effects. And for me, when I write scenes like that they should reverberate and they should disturb. Why shouldn't violence disturb us? It's a disturbing thing. It's it should sort of leave a kind of mark. One scene that does that can almost be the equivalent of 50 scenes that do the same thing. The question I usually ask when people talk about violent scenes and so on is, did it leave you numb or did it leave you horrified? If it left you horrified, it did a good thing. If it left you numb, then we slid into pornography. And that's something I'm very careful not to slide into. I think whatever act of violence should happen should resonate and should disturb, but it shouldn't be to the point where it gets you numb. It should, you know, a new scene of violence should disturb you all over again, and a third one should disturb you all over again. It's not our natural state to be brutal to people.
Right.
Well, I hope it's not.
Right.
And I have more problems with the kind of massive collateral damage that we just move on to the next scene. It's like watching a superhero movie. Somehow Superman managed to get New York evacuated.
Right.
11 million people evacuated in what, 10 minutes?
Right.
Not a single loss of life.
Right.
Like, really.
Talk about the book that's coming out in February and really a way in which it's a departure for you.
It's a departure for me, but it didn't feel like that much of a departure because I've always loved fantasy. We were talking about genre before. I mean, my two favorite genres are still, sci-fi and crime, or fantasy and crime mostly. And this novel started. I've said this before in another interview, where it started with a fight that I was having with somebody because the cast for The Hobbit was announced. And I was like, here we go again with this sort of nothing but, I was like, the caucasity. Actually, I didn't come up with that.
Is that a word?
A comedian said that Sunday, and I'm totally stealing it. I just loved it. But no, I didn't say that. But I was talking about why.
So it troubles you that everybody in Middle Earth is white?
Yeah. and it's like, and I said, if an Asian Hobbit was in the Shire, nobody would have cared. My friend, gave the whole thing. It's like it's about British mythology and British culture, and it's European this, and it's reflecting that. And I said, Lord of the Rings isn't real. It's you can do whatever you want with it.
Right.
And at one point I said, just keep your damn
It does
Hobbit.
have talking dragons.
Yeah. I said, just keep your damn Hobbit. And that sent me searching into a lot of the African mythology, some of which I knew because, a lot of that was not suppressed by slavery. A lot of that survived all of that, including Anansi's stories and so on. But I started thinking about, I'm still a fantasy geek. And I remember, you read novels when you're a teenager, when you're younger, and you sometimes, not always, try to situate yourselves in them. And if you're other, then you're never in them. And I've always wanted to, maybe my oldest fantasy, to write one of those sort of swords and sorcery kind of book where I was in it. So to a huge extent, it's just me scratching that geek itch. But the more I read into African folklore and mythology and history and so on, the book started to almost write itself. One thing that had to happen was me kind of sort of de-Europeanize how I was going to write it, which is funny because I was also reading a lot of Icelandic sagas and so on. I have a big soft spot for Vikings. What happened was I ended up with a trilogy, and it's basically a slave trader hires these mercenaries to find his child, and they botch it spectacularly, and the child is dead, and we need to know what happened. And there are only 3 witnesses, and each witness' testimony is a different novel. So I'm basically telling the same damn story 3 times.
And the first one comes out.
The first one comes out in February 5th. It's called Black Leopard, Red Wolf.
Look for it online at Amazon near you.
Or buy it in an independent bookstore so I can make more money.
Right. All right, well, we're going to now give you an opportunity to ask questions.
I'm curious about both of your experiences of being a political or politically engaged person in Minnesota versus New York.
Well, I don't know if I've been in New York long enough necessarily talk about New York. In Minnesota, it's really interesting and really complicated. When the Philando Castile verdict came out, I wrote a story. It was just a Facebook post called Smaller and Smaller and Smaller, about how I literally do not know how to behave in front of the police. I don't know if I should stand up and get shot. I don't know if I should kneel and get shot. I don't know if I should reach for my cell phone and get shot. I don't know if I should freeze and get shot. I don't know if I should tremble and get shot. I don't know if I should cry and get shot. I literally do not know what to do if I was in that situation. And that in itself was something that I think people could just, send me some thoughts and prayers. But I also, having lived there 11 years, I sort of threw it back in the average Minnesotan household, saying, I've been here 11 years and nobody's ever invited me to dinner. Everybody's nice. Minnesota nice is real. But nobody's ever, invited me to dinner.
Who invited you to dinner?
Fine, Brian Rosenberg invited me to dinner. Technically, you're a New Yorker. But it was interesting. So of course I got tons of dinner invitations. But it made me still examine the relationship between with this sort of how really well-meaning people still had to be sort of put on the spot or shamed into acting. One of the governor's sons had lunch with me, and he wanted to know, nobody wants to talk to me, and the activists don't want to talk to me, and blah, blah, blah. And I was saying, well, if I'm a Black Lives Matter activist, it looks the optics aren't that great that I'm coming to your posh restaurant to talk to you. How many of these communities have you gone into? And also, how about reaching out to them before the next person is shot? And as I say, I can speak to Minnesota more than here because I've been living there for so long. I think that in Minnesota, sometimes there's a little too much affirmation because we're all nice liberal folk. And I don't think we want to, talk about certain things. I got into an argument with an Uber driver because he doesn't understand what systematic racism is. And back in his day, there had been so much progress. And I said, well, if my kid is sucking his thumb, I'll leave him alone because he'll progress out of it. If he's stabbing little girls with a pencil, I say, cut that crap out now. There are some things you progress out of, and there's some things you need to cut that crap out now. And a lot of things that people think they're progressing out of was an illegitimate thing to begin with. Like, you're not supposed to progress out of racism. You shouldn't have been racist. Half of living in Minnesota is negotiating the Minnesota nice and negotiating the different ways, the very polite ways in which we say no. So that's interesting. As I say, I haven't lived there long enough yet, so I don't know. I haven't been here long enough yet to say how to deal with New York and their crap.
The electoral map is changing in Minnesota. I was curious to get your feedback around, especially St. Louis County.
Minneapolis, St. Paul. I mean, when we talk about liberal Minnesota, we really mean Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Duluth. And then we have what I call the Republican horseshoe, right around, Batman territory and so on. It's I'm sure everybody thinks where they live is not like anywhere else, but Minnesota really isn't like anywhere else. I remember in 2008, there were these 4 sort of really school-marmy church ladies, all like in their 70s and 80s, going around door to door, trying to convince people why they should support gay marriage. I was like, only in Minnesota you'd see that. I was like, and yet also only in Minnesota will Jesse Ventura become governor. Even I think the demographics are totally changing, and I think Minnesota, like everywhere else, become really galvanized by a whole new freshman set of politicians, in particular women. And I think a lot of that is changing. I think that at the same time, Trump was the first Republican to tour Minnesota in years. Usually the political wisdom is don't bother with Minnesota. And he bothered. And I think that there has been, one thing that has been happening is a deliberate attempt to split Minnesota rural from Minnesota urban. And I think that the really, really smarter politicians, certainly really smarter liberal ones, are realizing that you can't just depend on just the city. And I think a lot of that is happening. Most of the organizers I know aren't even in Minneapolis anymore. They're out in places which I have yet to visit. I think because they know that the thing we forget about the Rust Belt is that the Rust Belt is open to opinions and they're open to change. And that's why we keep calling them battleground states. So I think some of that is happening.